So here we go, my friends. Today is a major episode. As most of you are probably aware, we've got a serious impact that could come to the East Coast in the ports. There is many ocean lines now implementing huge additional costs. So what does this mean for our market? What does this mean for our customers, for profitability, and everything we thought we were getting back over the last 2 years? Can it be wiped out? Today on the Logistics Life. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Dean, my man. What an episode today. This is something, I've had friends of mine that are huge in the dray world talking about this. I'm going to say all the way back to June, where I had one individual who said, Dan, did you hear about what might happen with the ports on the East Coast? And I was like, what are you talking about? I hadn't even heard of it. Like, we're now in September, and this is something that they were saying in June could happen.
Yeah, they're a long way apart on the negotiating table right now. We've got the unions are asking for 77 to 78% pay increase. They've been offered 32 to 39%. So they're a long way apart on the dollars, but I'm not sure where they are on automation, because automation is the really big sticking point. They don't want any automation, essentially, which is really interesting, Dan, because it puts us at a disadvantage globally. Because, we don't have the level of automation they do in some ports in Asia, for example, that are fully automated and run 24/7. So we have issues here with productivity, and of course, this is at the heart of it, is automation. And I understand it. I have the same views when it comes to things like driverless trucks. Putting people out of work just doesn't sit well with me when the economics don't stack up. So, but I'm not professing to be an expert on the waterfront in terms of what automation will do. But the general theme is automation means less jobs. I think that's a fairly well accepted outcome of all of this. Sometimes it can be to your advantage too. We have it in our business, right? Automation's helped you and I through technology and data integrations and all sorts of data analytics software programs to be better at our job. So it's not all bad, but I think when it comes to automated dock handling with autonomous cranes, autonomous tugs that move containers around, you can see a net loss of jobs fairly easily from that. So they're the two sticking points, Dan. 40,000 dock workers, 50 to 60% of our goods come into the US Gulf and East Coast. I pulled some data on Sunday to see what this would be, but as we were talking about at the start of the show, a one-day strike would take 5 days to clear. This is according to Sea Intelligence. A 1 week strike would cause slowdowns until mid-November. So that's like a 6-week backup. 2 weeks would take you into January because of the congestion of ships and backup of containers. Because remember, on the West Coast, for every 4 containers that come in loaded, 3 have to go back empty. And we've got Chinese New Year coming up in the new year, so there's a need to get empty containers back into Asia for the surge before Chinese New Year shutdown. On the East Coast, it's more like 2 to 1. For every 2 that come in, 1 go back out empty, so that you need to have the empties cycling.
Well, and I can imagine at this point, not every company that needs their product in market for Q4, the busy season, has their containers landed. So these containers could actually be caught. And I'm just thinking of one customer in particular. I know, come month end, come quarter end, and it was always this huge push where we were, literally updating containers on the rail and at the port and berthing and everything. Literally, like, are they ingated? What's going on? Where are they? And doing our best to almost minute by minute update on where they were, because things are always delayed, right? We're in the hurry up and wait industry, really, when we think about it. And I got word yesterday from a colleague that a friend of mine and colleague that Merk had implemented a $3,000 fee if it does go through, and Merk was saying one day of strike for every 6 days backlog.
Right.
So I think, and then we were just talking MSCs. Now you said come out and implemented a $1,500 on a 20-foot can. So I got a couple of different thoughts here, Dean, and I'd love your take on it. Number one is, you order goods, this is going to mainly impact Europe, but I know it's going to impact every other port because boats are going to start doing detours, right? It's kind of like what we did on the West Coast. We started bringing things to the East Coast. I mean, depending on how long this is. Apparently I'm hearing, and I'd love your thoughts on it and confirmation, like the government saying we're not stepping in. But from a bigger level, I guess it's, companies order goods, their goods are on it, and now all of a sudden these fees are going to be impacting. And if companies are anything like my old bedsheet customer, there's like 1 or 2 extra charges away from not being profitable again. I honestly don't know if companies can sustain that after everything that's happened, right? Like we look at the pandemic, and I know we keep going back to the pandemic, but for all of you watching and listening, I think we need to for certain things, Dean, because companies that were 50, 75 years old, always profitable, were losing millions, millions a year. And, that's not sustainable. Just like it's not sustainable in our business. Trucking companies are going out of business because they're losing so much money because they're not profitable. And, you go back to the automation piece. Well, actually, let's solve that first, and then let's talk about the automation piece. What are your thoughts on that?
On which piece?
On just the profitability. I mean, like I understand, I didn't realize it was a 79% increase. I'm wondering what that would do to the overall price of bringing freight in from overseas.
Well, don't forget those vessels that are tied up now, will be tied up, were shipped and rates were negotiated when rates were much higher. Maybe a couple of months ago, right? So to your point, your shippers have already paid for a higher rate, I suspect, on the inbound side, outbound from Asia or Europe. So even though spot rates have come way back down, right, on the ocean side, so they'll pay for it there. So Dan, there's obviously going to be more cost. There'll be surcharges, but the ports will probably relax the pickup times, like before detention or demurrage starts to, the clock starts to tick. So there could be some flexibility there, although that could be another opportunity to charge people more if they're not getting the containers picked up in time. So you're going to pay a lot more if you have to divert to St. John, Nova Scotia, Halifax, Montreal, Quebec for urgent freight, which is, I think, exactly where ships would be thinking about redirecting. The ones leaving Europe now, right, would be thinking about, do we add a port call in Halifax if they're not already? And then does that provide a road example? Because as you well know, there's not a lot of rail opportunities to move any vessels, any freight that lands in Canada into the US for that last minute urgent freight. But Dan, I think this is a bigger break bulk Ro-Ro story than it is anything else, because the Eastern Gulf Coast is so if you break down the numbers, right, if you look at just the containers and the tonnage, so separate break bulk, non-container, and Ro-Ro into one bucket and put containers in another bucket, right? There's 2 types of freight. 75% of the nation's break bulk cargo comes into the Eastern Gulf Coast. All of the top 10 ports for Ro-Ro break bulk are in the Eastern Gulf Coast. Baltimore's number 1, right? Brunswick, New York City, Houston. Automobiles, Dan, this is where I think it really gets interesting. Automobiles account for 70% of the tonnage on the Eastern Gulf Coast, 10% trucks, tractors. 91% of the automobile Ro-Ro tonnage comes in from North Europe, 80% of it from Germany. So this becomes
already at record highs for automobiles, so they're just about to go up.
Well, it's possible, because what you're talking about is supply chain disruptions for auto parts, in particular for transmissions, engine blocks, fully built up cars. Because if you think about, where have all of the big German automakers located their plants? The southeastern US, Alabama, right? So you're seeing a lot of automotive automotive construction of vehicles, which requires parts in the southeast of the United States. So I think this becomes a really big auto parts industry supply chain crisis as much as it is anything. Because remember, when the Key Bridge fell, This was all about Baltimore and the Ro-Ro side of the business, because it's the number one port for roll on, roll off. Now, on the truckload side, it's the low season. So remember, construction season, planting season, building season, all of those seasons start in March when imports peak. So we're not there yet in terms of timing. But on the container side, the Eastern Gulf Coast accounts for 52% of the container imports and 69% of exports. So the East Coast is not only the biggest for ro-ro and break bulk tonnage, it's also the biggest for exports. So that's where we really start to hurt the export side of our country is this here. So it's actually fairly big. Furniture's the big commodity. But most of, well, not most, but compared to the West Coast, we get a lot more on the East Coast coming from Northern Europe. Things like wine, plastics, auto parts, vegetables. We get 80% of our wine imports come from the Mediterranean. No surprise there. But, almost a third, over a third of auto parts arrive in Charleston. It's the number one port for auto parts. So you can see the impact this would have. And we had John McCown on our show yesterday. He's an international shipping expert. And he said, there's not a lot of options people have got. If you've got a container on a ship or anything on a ship and this strike happens next week, there's not much you can do because where do you go? He said, you're not going to go all the way to the West Coast via the Panama Canal because he said, it's a bit like the Red Sea crisis. Do I go the 12 days extra around to get to Europe or do I wait it out? And remember the decision was made when the Ever Given blocked the Suez Canal. Yes. People said, will we wait it out or will we go around? Well, it's a similar situation here. You don't know how long this strike is going to go. And what he was saying is a lot of people are just going to have to wait at anchor until this clears itself. Now, what he did say was very interesting, and I think this is the most likely outcome, is that you won't see a strike, but you will see port disruptions. And we saw it, if you remember back to last year on the show, we talked about what they were doing in the Port of Oakland, where the port workers red tagged the machine and said it's not safe. And it blew out a whole shift, right? So a whole day of productivity was lost. So I think that's the most likely outcome is you'll see go slows and tag lockouts on machinery to disrupt port flow. So there will be disruption. I think that's the most likely scenario. But heck, Dan, if the
what level will it be disrupted?
Yeah, but if they actually go on strike, it couldn't be at a worst possible time for our supply chain in terms of resilience. Well, our resiliency is better. We're much better at handling volatility, I think, but it couldn't happen at a worse time because I suspect there's a lot of shippers like your bedsheet customer who have, maybe taken the bet that this won't happen and they've been sending their containers in for retail season because we're at the point now where that volume needs to be on land now before it goes on a truck or train. Now, I'll wrap up this thought with one point where I am in Los Angeles today. By the time we get to the 28th of September, we have 136,000 TEU arriving between this week and next week. So in the next week, we've got 136,000 TEU. That drops down to 98,000 after that. And then by mid-October, it's into the 120,000. But what I guess my point is, and this was confirmed by the Marine Exchange, is the big push of imports to get into the country here on the West Coast is happening right now, and then it'll taper off. And I suspect it's much the same on the other side of the country on the East Coast. So there's going to be some disruptions for sure. Whether there's an all-out strike, I don't know.
I agree with that. And here comes another point, and it might not be that popular, but this is, one big reason for automation because they don't go on strike. Right. Yep. And then you look at the other side of it. Yep. I don't know. I'm ignorant to what kind of raises workers have had, where they are on the pay scale. But if we're talking that much, like they're at 39, they want 79, what you were saying at the beginning. Yep. what does that overall cost do to operate a port, which then in turns makes ocean shipping more expensive, which makes products more expensive, which in the end we all pay for anyways. We found that out very well with produce and everything and groceries over the last little while. You need to look no further than countries like Cuba, who are struggling for things like bread and everything because they got most of their grain from Ukraine and stuff, right? And with war, they haven't been able to ship out. So there's all these, I guess, from a corporate perspective, and I guess it's like either side, right? We have the argument for either side. If they get the 79%, what do you see happening to overall prices for shippers bringing stuff in from Europe? At what point then does that, and here's kind of where we go, Canada, as you know, we just went through the whole CNCP fiasco, where the government stepped in and said it's not an essential service, which is asinine in my opinion, but that's a whole other show. But, and then we look at it and we say, okay, so we give in now. Now what happens in 2 months on the West Coast? Is the West Coast then going to say, whoa, time out here. You just got 79% and all you had to do is this, and maybe the government steps in. So and again, I'm not an expert here, so please, people, don't start tearing me apart online if you're a union worker or whatever. But I'm just wondering at what point this ends. At what point does the country just say, you know what? No, automation is the key. Hopefully, like anything, right? Like we're having conversations in our company about what can we automate? How much time can we give back to some of the team members? And one of the conversations is, well, we don't want to let them go. How can we reallocate those resources? So, and I know, Dean, I'm, obviously very aware that most companies are like, well, I'm not going to worry about reallocating. I'm going to make sure that our shareholders make all the money and they're not in the mindset of leaving something on the table. But I do believe, and love your thoughts on this. I do believe that no matter what we do, right? If we do run to autonomous vehicles, if we do run to autonomous ports, I think the reallocation of those people is going to be one of the most critical pieces, not necessarily just saying, hey, we have the technology to do it now, let's do it. It's how are we going to reallocate? Because there's skills, there's like wicked ideas and strategy and mindsets that we can't just let sit and do nothing. Like there's, and I don't know what the answer is. And I mean, I'm one person sitting behind a desk and we're doing, one show, you're sitting at and it's like, but I don't know. I just think there needs to be a global shift in thought as we enter this new age, because the reality is, Dean, I believe, just like as much as I hate it at times, but I believe trucks are going to be autonomous at some point in probably the very near future, with all things considering. So will ports, because you look at Asia, they're able to pump out stuff. And if we automated ports and made things easier for other people to buy, right? Like when we look at the whole structure of purchasing and what we do, it's to create less friction in our brains, right? And if we're able to get companies to buy our goods in North America at the least amount of friction, what will that do to our GDP? What will that do to companies being able to export? And I know it's a way bigger topic than just the ports, but I'd love your take on it.
Well, I mean, personally, I'm not a fan of people losing their jobs at all.
Absolutely not.
I think that's the last thing we want, but there are ways you can do things better. So you made a couple of points there. The West Coast already negotiated their 5-year agreement last year, right? So you can see, at some point in the future, that'll come up. But automation's a really big deal because it makes our goods more expensive. If we're thinking about, nearshoring and making things, making more things in America, labor costs are a big reason why we went to China in the first place. Right? They had much cheap. So that's why we've got cheap TVs, and my home is full of things that come from overseas. So that whole business model, we've been all guilty of fueling for the last 20 to 25 years. Hard to turn around and say now, we want to be more competitive and make things here in the United States. When the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach rank last in efficiency, that ranks the efficiency of over 350 ports worldwide. So we are a very inefficient country when it comes to the processing of imports and exports. So that's the challenge we've got, is it'll cost us more, right? So all these wage increases and lack of automation, it eventually flows through to the cost of that container. Because it's like a truck that sits at a food warehouse for 9 hours to get a live load loaded, right? That's baked into the rate. You want to bet that you're paying for that in your rate per mile, which flows on to you and I. So eventually, I think the bigger picture is it really affects our ability to be competitive on the world stage. Now, what waters that argument down is we're a massive economy, and our desire to buy things online, cheap things online, is staggering. So I don't know that in the big scheme of things, it makes a big difference, because there's just so much that goes on in our economy. Because if you're thinking about how does this end up at the supermarket shelf in the price of a commodity, you're talking about fractions of a penny in terms of the impact. So I don't know how this plays out, Dan. I just think the bigger issue is it's going to affect our competitiveness. All of that is baked into the price. I sat here in the port of Los Angeles yesterday, and I was kind of shocked at the Marine Exchange has a business called the Vessel Traffic System. I think it's called VTS, where they collect data from 55 ocean carriers and then sell it back to them, because none of them are integrated in terms of when will a vessel arrive, where is it, how many tugs does it need, what port's it going to, because each of them are very individual entities. Whereas what happens now with the Marine Exchange, they collate all the data, put it into a big software homegrown system they built, and they schedule all of the ships into the port of Los Angeles. So you would say, why isn't it already integrated? Why aren't they already integrated into something that they're all part of? And it's not how they work. So, and that's about the opposite of what it is at, like Rotterdam, for example, where you've got high levels of automation. So we're way behind when it comes to automation in this country. But I'm also, part of me is torn by that discussion. I don't want to see people out of work, but heck, I don't want to see trucks sitting like they do around the ports in lines that are hundreds of trucks long. Like I've spent so many hours at ports in Sydney trying to get loaded, 24 hours as the crane drivers drive past me 1,000 times, ignoring me. I mean, there is a lot of inefficiency. So I think there's give and take on both sides, but the inefficiency of our port system here, there needs to be some exchange. Like, so in exchange for the pay increase, what are we going to do with efficiency, with truck wait times? Like, how do we improve that? How do we speed things up? Because that may be a way to offset the pay increase, is to speed up the efficiency of the overall port. I'm not sure that's what the outcome would be, but that's something that I'd like to see happen if we get to the negotiating table.
Well, and it's you go back to where you were talking about 9 hours for a live load. And if you have to sit for 9 hours as a company, I would, and again, to each his own, you look at that and go, well, why are we bringing trucks in if we're taking 9 hours to load them? Like, let's be smart about this. Let's reorganize how we're loading. Let's reorganize the schedule. And if we're inefficient at the port, I agree. I think if there's going to be any change, let's look at efficiencies. And maybe there's a better way. And I mean, obviously, again, it's just you and I sitting here talking about it. There's people at way higher levels than you and I that are going to make these decisions. I don't know. I just don't see a victory here for anyone. Like, if it's a victory for one, somebody else loses. And the whole mentality of leaving something on the table has gone out the window. It's not even there, not even close to being there. Right. And I don't know. I look at it and say, you know what, have we not over the last, even just call it the last 4 years of our lives, learned a lot? And what are we doing with that information to make it actionable to better the lives of everyone involved? Right. You take more time at a port, it now not only with the pay increase is going to cost more, because eventually it will go back to everything. Whatever shipping companies pay to ports to get things done is going to be 79% more expensive, which is then going to go. And I mean, I don't know if they necessarily the number is 79, but it's going to be more expensive, which then is going to translate to the shipper, which is going to be more expensive for them buying the goods, which is going to translate into us paying more for it. So at what point do we get a 79% increase in pay? And then at what point does that happen where the company then becomes not profitable, company goes out of business? Now we're just in this, like this constant vortex, this loop of less when we're trying to be, generate more. And I don't know what that answer is, Dean, but it's like, it's frustrating for one. Obviously, I'm sure a lot of people are frustrated. I have people calling me saying, Dan, these deals we're putting together, we got to put them together soon because this is what's going to happen. And it's going to destroy everything that we just worked on for the last 3 months. And so people are now scattering to try and get it done, because as these things happen, it changes everything down. It's like throwing a rock in a pond. It changes the shoreline forever.
It's just, while you were chatting, I was looking at truck turn times in the Port of Los Angeles here, and this is where the data gets a little bit squirrely, because I had this argument with the people in Savannah. The turn times here in Los Angeles are second shift 52 minutes, first shift 41 minutes. So this gets to where the heart of the problem is. And I should have said this earlier when it comes to the inefficiency of our ports here. When you talk to the port, people that run the port, they say it's not the problem of the port workers, right? Because they can load trucks, day and night through the appointment time system here in Los Angeles. What truckers say is, what's the point of me loading at midnight if I can't get into a warehouse till 8 a.m. the next day? He said it's the warehouses that aren't open that's the problem. If you think about all your warehouses around where you live are regular shippers, not big warehouses, receiving at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And the answer is no, right? No. So that's where it becomes really difficult, because that's what costs us more. There are supply chain impediments all the way through the process that really limit the free flowing of our imports and exports. But to my point about wait times, that a lot of the terminals publish their wait times. So it takes 52 minutes in-gate, out-gate, for example, on one of these here, one of the terminals here in Los Angeles. But what it ignores, and I did this with GPS location from ELDs, I counted the number of minutes the truck sit outside the gate, because the in-gate out time is maybe 52 minutes. But what about the 2 hours you spent in a line of 100 trucks?
I was just going to ask you that, because I was like, 52 minutes actually isn't bad at a port, but it's only from when they actually in-gate them to when they leave, when they're ready for them, I guess.
Well, so I saw it firsthand yesterday. I was curious because I drove around and had a look at all of these lines of trucks, and things were moving, but very slowly, but the lines were just awful. And I go back to a heated discussion we had with the people on the East Coast, where I published the wait times at the Port of Savannah and other ports, and they blew up because they said that's not accurate. And I said, well, it's exactly accurate, because they're not inside your terminal. They're waiting. Well, it's not our problem. They should have arrived on time. They arrived too early, all of this pushback. And I said, no, that's not how it works, because it's the same at warehouses. When you look at the dots on a map of truck positioning lat longs, and if you geofence the shipper's front gate, what you see are dots inside the gate, unloading, loading, and a massive pile of dots outside the gate down the street, right? So the true wait time is not what it takes once you get inside and outside the gate. So that's where I think we've got so much inefficiency. But then the last point here was really interesting. They've got a big push towards completely alternative energy vehicles here by 2035. I saw hardly any old trucks belching diesel. In fact, I saw none. And they've got a lot of clean trucks going on here. So there's a big push for automation and technology. It's still an efficient system. It still works here on the West Coast, but the East Coast is going to be a whole nother battle. We've got a bit of time to go. What are we, Wednesday, right? So we've got a bit of time before this may work itself out of the market. But rest assured, with the hurricane coming up through the Gulf now, and if a strike occurs next week, that will flip the truckload market it will absolutely turn the truckload market on its head because of the amount of disruption. So I'm already looking at, for example, when I look at our market condition index today, I'm seeing capacity is very tight outbound from Elizabeth, New Jersey, and it's starting to tighten in Houston. It's very tight in Houston already. So I'm looking at my major ports where we're going to see a lot of truckload activity. Capacity is still reasonably loose in Savannah. It's a fairly neutral market right now. So there will be, if this starts to progress, what you'll start to see is a mad panic to move whatever's sitting around the port markets before next Tuesday, or in fact, before next Monday evening at midnight.